My name is Asha Aiden, and I'm co-president of Interfaith in Action. The event tonight is sponsored by the Northeast Iowa Peace and Justice Center and Interfaith in Action. Tonight, I was given the privilege of introducing our speaker, Professor Todd Green. And as someone who likes to speak, I was not going to turn this down. Todd Green is an associate professor of religion at Luther College, where he has served on the faculty since 2008. He's also a former advisor on Islamophobia at the State Department in Washington, D.C. His research in Islamophobia has led him to two books. The first, The Fear of Islam, An Introduction to Islamophobia in the West. And this book was actually cited in an amicus curiae brief filed in the Supreme Court by the NAACP, the National Urban League, and other civil rights organizations. And his second book, which came out this past year, is called Presumed Guilty, Why We Shouldn't Ask Muslims to Condemn Terrorism. In this book, he argues that asking Muslims to condemn terrorist attacks is a distraction that prevents majority populations in the United States and Europe both from facing their own violent histories and from asking critical questions about how their country's national security initiatives and foreign policies contribute to a violent world order. And I just read this book for class, so pick it up. Please join me in welcoming Professor Todd Green.
All right, good evening, everybody. So thank you for the introduction, Asha, for co-sponsoring this event, the Northeast Iowa Peace and Justice Center and the Interfaith in Action Group. And I know this is the end of the year and you've got a lot of busy things to do, but it's also the beginning of the election season, and where we get interested in politics every 4 years here in Iowa. So this is, I think, a very appropriate topic as a result. So I want to say up front that my intent this evening is actually not to explore the particular ways that Islamophobia has become ingrained in U.S. domestic or foreign policy. So I'm not going to be offering any in-depth analysis of the USA Patriot Act or the Muslim ban or the surveillance of Muslim Americans or the war on terror. I mean, I'll reference that stuff. It'll be there kind of lurking in the background. But what I'm going to focus more on this evening is Islamophobia's role in presidential politics, specifically presidential elections and election cycles. So my focus will mostly then be on rhetoric and policy proposals put forth by presidential candidates or presidents to leverage votes or to shape voter behavior. My hope is to offer a bird's eye view of how anti-Muslim narratives and proposals in presidential elections have evolved over the past 2 decades. What trends can we identify since 2000, 2001? How have the two main political parties differed in their relationship to Islamophobia during election cycles? And based on where we have been from 9/11, particularly through today, what can we reasonably expect to encounter in the 2020 presidential election cycle when it comes to the role played by Islamophobia? And I'm going to turn on my microphone here. I have it. I just forgot to flip it to the on position. My voice tends to carry anyway. There we go. All right. But what I'm going to argue is that for Republican presidents and presidential candidates, what we have seen since 2000, 2001 particularly, is an increasing effort to make more overt appeals to Islamophobic narratives and policies. The party has transitioned mostly from using coded Islamophobic language, implicit language, dog whistles at times, to much more unambiguous Islamophobic rhetoric, particularly with Donald Trump. So the instrumentalization of Islamophobia has become a more deliberate strategy among the upper echelon of the Republican Party, a calculated effort, I'm going to argue, an effort to mobilize a certain portion of the electorate to leverage votes. And we should expect to see more of this in the 2020 election, even though we don't have a large primary field, as far as I know, for Republicans, as we're going to have for Democrats. For the Democratic Party, what I think we have seen over the past 2 decades is what I'm going to call consistent ambivalence. The party's presidential candidates and the one Democratic president we've had since 2001 have sent mixed messages, basically, about Islam and Muslims. The party as a whole, in my opinion, has struggled to find its moral footing when it comes to responding to, encountering Islamophobia. And I do think there's some exceptions in the current massive field of candidates that we have right now in the Democratic Party. So again, this is not a wholesale sort of indication of what the entire party is doing, but there are some exceptions, and yet I would still argue that as a whole, the Democratic Party continues to struggle when it comes to how to respond to Islamophobia. And maybe I think that has something to do with the fact that the Democratic Party has, to some degree, internalized Islamophobia and on certain issues, particularly when it comes to Israel or to certain representative named Ilhan Omar, the Democratic Party is really struggling right now in terms of how to respond to some controversies in a way that doesn't cross the line over into Islamophobia. So that's where I'm going with all this today. But I do want to spend a good bit of time on where we've been, so we can sort of, again, trace these trajectories of the past 3 or 4 election cycles, so that we understand that maybe what to expect has some precedent to it. To start this, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this part of it, but just kind of giving you a heads up to let you know, we have had presidential candidates or presidents who've done pretty good here and there when it comes to positive messaging on Islam and Muslims. It hasn't been all bad news in the past couple of decades. Bush, most famously, just some days after 9/11, famously came out to the Islamic Center in Washington, D.C. to say that Islam is a religion of peace, that the faith of terrorism is not the true faith of Islam. This was quoted a lot, cited a lot, in most cases sort of framed in a very positive manner, that Bush was really trying, at least publicly in his rhetoric, to signal that Muslim Americans should not be on the receiving end of a backlash when it came to the 9/11 terrorist attacks. And so this was a very deliberate effort, I think, on his part, and that's worth noting. He also was known on occasion to make the argument that Christians and Muslims worship the same God. It's kind of a pluralistic argument. It wasn't always theologically worked out in a sophisticated manner that we might expect in a theology class at Luther College, but that doesn't matter. I do think he really believes that Christians and Muslims, among others, are worshiping the same God. He's called some flack for this in certain quarters of some Christian conservatives, but I do think this is a genuine belief on his part. It's also worth noting about Bush that in 2000, what little data we have on this in terms of exit polls indicates that Muslim Americans, in terms of their voting patterns, voted overwhelmingly for George Bush over Al Gore in the year 2000. That was the last time Muslim Americans voted overwhelmingly for the Republican candidate for some reasons I think we're about to see. But that just goes to show that this has been a very short period of time in which the political climate has changed significantly when it comes to Islamophobia, frankly in both parties, but particularly the Republican Party. It hasn't always been like this. In the year 2000, the Republicans really did court Muslim voters. They did it quite effectively, I would add. For his part, Obama's also expressed some pluralistic views about Muslims and Islam. In a 2007 New York Times interview with, at the time he was running for the primary nomination, he said that Islam's call to prayer is one of the prettiest sounds on earth at sunset. It's really kind of an articulation of a sense of holy envy when it comes to Islam, something that was awe-inspiring in him when it came to Islam. At the end of his second term in 2016 in Baltimore, he also made another statement, a very series of statements actually, in which he came out and said that Islam and Christianity actually have some common bonds and common roots, in this case variations of the golden rule, right, to do unto others. That Islam teaches that, Christianity teaches that, we have something that binds us together. So this is out there. I'm not going to dwell a lot more on this. There are other examples from both of these former presidents, but there are instances in which we have presidents or presidential candidates in the past 2 decades really try to make deliberate efforts to build bridges and to frame Islam and Muslims in a much more positive way. Which is what makes the rest of this all the more depressing in some ways, right? Because we know that capacity is there. In terms of Islamophobia, again, in the 2000 election, there's not much to really talk about pre-9/11. As I mentioned a while ago, the Republican Party did a really effective job of reaching Muslim voters then. 2004, 2008, now we're getting post 9/11, and there are some narratives that are being put out there early on that do cross the line into what I would think of as Islamophobia, sort of casting Muslims or Islam as a religion to be feared or to have some sort of hostility towards or as our enemy. Bush most famously or infamously called the build-up to the war on terror a crusade. That crusade language didn't go over well in the Muslim majority world. It certainly didn't go over well among Muslim Americans here, amongst many others, right? And he did back off. He got criticized and he did back off the crusading language. So this wasn't a consistent rhetoric that he was employing. But this was sort of a bit of a sign that you know, he had some mixed messaging when it came to rhetoric and policies that pertain to Muslim or Muslim majority regions. It was really after the 2004 election, going into 2005, that the Bush administration started more deliberately to ramp up its rhetoric when it came to trying, at least casting Islam as somehow having an organic relationship to extremism or radicalism or violence or terrorism. This is where we see the real dedication to the language of Islamic radicalism, Islamic extremism, Bush himself at one point talked about Islamofascism. This is not language he used early on in his first administration, but by the second administration, he was investing in this more, even though it wasn't actually in the immediate build-up to an election. But it's language that would start to stick in the Republican Party, and by 2008, you do have some Republican contenders, most notably Rudy Giuliani, who gets very invested in this language and starts calling out Democrats for not using language like radical Islamic terrorism, which now is Donald Trump's one of his favorite things to do, right, is to talk about this language of radical Islamic terrorism. But that starts around 2005. The reason for this, to some degree, is that the Bush administration is trying to rejuvenate, resuscitate some support for the Iraq War, which was a difficult thing to do in 2005 into 2006. So trying to ratchet the language to make a case for why we need to be engaged in military action there. In 2008, though, is when I think we see the first significant election that involves a lot of more overt Islamophobia, some of which I just referred to with the language that gets introduced about Islam and terrorism. But the more significant narrative, even in 2008, was the sort of religious conspiracy theory that Barack Obama himself was a Muslim. And that actually emerged in both parties. This is not just the Republican Party, the Democratic Party too had a hand in this. There was a campaign worker for the Hillary Clinton campaign in 2007 and 8 who had forwarded an email circulating this sort of conspiracy that Obama was a secret Muslim or a closet Muslim. That campaign worker was removed from the campaign initially, but it just goes to show this was a very contentious year in terms of the election on both sides, because both parties were having a primary. And some folks in both parties found some leverage here, some traction with this notion of Obama as a Muslim. We can go for a long time and maybe revisit this in the discussion about why that's significant, and just the very idea that that would be a bad thing, right? Suggest Islamophobia as a way of slurring someone to call them a Muslim, irrespective of what they actually are. Of course, Obama was a Christian. I have a friend who teaches at UC Berkeley and Zaytuna College in California named Hatem Bazian, who argues that around this time, this is where we see that the M word, Muslim, becomes something of the new N word in political discourse, right? That it really does start to have a racialized slur tone to it. To call someone a Muslim is sort of degrade them, or that's at least the impression, right? And it took someone like Colin Powell to try to say, hey, there actually isn't anything wrong with being a Muslim. But the Obama campaign itself struggled to respond to this accusation at times, right, because of how the position itself in terms of acceptability. But you see here in this 2008 poll from June, I believe, that you got about 12% of those polled who actually believe that Obama's a Muslim. One of the ironies, of course, is that back in March of 2008, there was another big controversy about Obama and religion that wasn't about Islam at all. It was about a pastor named Jeremiah Wright who was preaching radical theology and God damn America and critiquing U.S. imperialism. So, this idea, well, is he a radical black Christian? Is he a radical black Muslim? And that you actually have some portion of the population who just can actually not understand that those are contradictory narratives, right? But it also goes to show that the level of racism at work here, and that Islamophobia itself is a form of racism and racializing people. So that's the big narrative of 2008 that I'll come back to in a little bit. It sticks. It's not just in 2008. This will keep coming back in terms of a narrative that's going to be pushed, and it's in the Republican Party that's going to actually build more and more, even greater than it was back in 2008. John McCain, for his part, who was the Republican nominee in 2008, he had a few gaffes. He joked about bombing Iran, singing Bomb Bomb Iran, if you remember that, to the Beach Boys' Barbaran. And they had this incident in Lakeville, Minnesota in October of 2008 where a woman in the crowd with a microphone said, I can't support Barack Obama because he's an Arab. And McCain, and I genuinely believe this is what he was trying to do in terms of being a civil statesperson, responded, no, he was not an Arab, he's a decent family man. Not an Arab, a decent family man. It's a problematic statement in many ways, though he oftentimes gets cited for the statement as a good thing about what he was doing in terms of trying to keep the campaign in terms of a civil discourse. But it is sort of a reminder of how these kind of prejudicial narratives still can be deeply ingrained. That being said, there wasn't a lot of overt Islamophobic signaling in the McCain campaign in 2008. I can point to some other incidents like this, but none of it, in my opinion, came across as particularly overt, right, or strategic or calculated. Obama, for his part, the Obama campaign at least in 2008, had some of its own issues here and there. The most significant of which is a Detroit rally in 2008, where Obama was scheduled to speak, and so his campaign handlers, and we know about these folks here in Iowa, right? Whose job it is to sort of stage behind the podium where the speaker is going to be, who's going to be there. Now, oftentimes these are handpicked people. It's not just random people who show up behind the stage, because these are usually on TV. So we know how that works in Iowa. Usually it's some kind of racial, religious diversity or other kinds of diversity in some of these cases. And that's certainly what was happening in Detroit, except in that crowd behind the stage, before Obama came on stage, were two Muslim women wearing a hijab. And some of Obama's campaign handlers removed them from behind the stage because they thought the optics may not be great for Obama, particularly after that narrative of Obama being a Muslim, and they didn't want to reinforce that, right? So this became newsworthy, and a lot of media outlets picked up on this, and Obama had to apologize personally, and actually quite profusely, for this really bad decision. But again, it's another example of the Democratic Party, some signs of internalizing Islamophobia, right? Maybe not being quite as overt, but still even that impulse to say, oh, that's bad optics to have two Muslim women behind Obama itself says something about a party that's struggling to try to figure out how to respond to Islamophobia at times. It is really the 2012 election where we see one of the first big changes in the instrumentalization of Islamophobia. And a lot of this actually has to do with what happened in between 2008 and 2012. And that's the year 2010 happened. But something in 2010 happened as well that I think, in my opinion, changed the strategy, particularly the Republican Party, but also caused some difficulties for the Democratic Party. And that was the prolonged conflict and controversy over the proposed Islamic Center in Lower Manhattan in the summer of 2010. And some of you might remember the news for about 4 months on cable news and print media was story after story about the controversy over whether Muslims should be allowed to build an Islamic center some blocks away from where the World Trade Center once stood. It was a controversy ultimately manufactured by a budding industry that we now call today in my work and scholarship the Islamophobia Industry, a very well-funded anti-Muslim hate network, in this case led by Pamela Geller and Robert Spencer, who manufactured this crisis, but they did it quite effectively. And what we have for about several months, 3 or 4 months, is a lot of politicians, including Republican candidates or those would-be candidates who want to come out in public and make a statement and position themselves in relation to this controversy. A lot of them, most of them came out in opposition to whether this idea that Muslims should be allowed to build, or should build at least, an Islamic Center in Lower Manhattan. And they were very much in touch with public opinion. Public opinion polls around July and August of 2010 suggested that the majority of Americans, about 57% of Americans, were opposed to the idea of Muslims building a Islamic Center in Lower Manhattan. So there was a lot of political posturing on both sides. That includes Barack Obama, and he felt a lot of pressure to speak on this topic. And eventually he does come out and speak. Initially he says, Muslims have the constitutional right, the First Amendment right, to build a worship structure as long as they follow all the rules that you're supposed to follow with zoning and whatnot. He gets some backlash. He actually takes that backlash to heart, and then about a day or two later he steps back. He steps off of what he said, not quite as strongly at least, and says the following: I was not commenting, and will not comment, on the wisdom of putting a mosque there. I was commenting very specifically on the right that people have that dates back to our founding. So he equivocated. In this one controversy, in Barack Obama's struggle to respond in a consistent way, we have the Democratic Party in a nutshell. I condemn any efforts to stop Muslims from exercising their constitutional rights, but hey, I'm not saying this is a good idea. All right? So we're trying to appeal to a broad segment of the population at least. It's constitutionally right for Muslims to build a Islamic Center there, but I'm not sure it's morally right. So he doesn't have a strong moral statement or moral position he's taken, which is par for the course in many cases for the Democratic Party. Having a sense or an impulse to speak out against Islamophobia, and this was pretty rampant Islamophobia and the manufacture of this controversy, but not really having a strong sense of why, which I think has been part of the problem of the Democratic Party. An ongoing theme here is the Republican Party becomes increasingly pro-Islamophobia. The Democratic Party, though, never becomes strongly anti-Islamophobia. So I'm skeptical about trying to make a clear dichotomy between these two. And Obama's response here is an indication. It's much more implicit here, right? With some presidential candidates at the time, or people who are trying to enter into the fray by 2010, 2011, we have now an opening that they see to stir up much more deliberately and in a much more calculated way Islamophobia, to appeal to very explicit Islamophobic narratives. There is no dog whistling here, right? This is not coded language. This is people like Newt Gingrich who are comparing Nazis to Muslims who want to build an Islamic center in Lower Manhattan, who at one point starts to talk about Sharia and fear-mongering over Sharia and Muslims trying to impose Sharia law in the United States. In fact, 2010 is the beginning, the real beginning of that narrative being put out there in political discourse. Prior to 2010, you don't have many people except on the far, far right trying to fear-monger about Sharia. But 2010 is a major turning point, both at the national level and at the state level, as some states start to try to pass anti-Sharia legislation. And as we'll see, this sticks in terms of the playbook on Islamophobia in presidential politics. Gingrich is one of the people who helps introduce that. Herman Cain, some of you might remember Herman Cain as well, asked in an interview, would you be comfortable appointing a Muslim to your cabinet or as a judge? Nope, I will not. There is this creeping attempt. Creeping is a word that people like to use in connection to Sharia. Creeping attempt to gradually ease Sharia law and the Muslim faith into our government. This notion that Muslims are this fifth column infiltrating the country, sort of like a Trojan horse. It's a narrative we have seen over and over again in the history of the United States with religious minority communities, with Catholics, with Jews, now with Muslims. So it's not a new idea that you have this foreign element infiltrating the country that's trying to impose its own law on the United States government and taking over in that way. But today it's Muslims, it's not Jews or Catholics that are subject to that narrative in quite the same way. So again, Sharia law, you start to have some Republican candidates who see a winner in that strategy and that tool coming out of the toolkit. Okay, Trump was not a candidate in 2012, but he still participated in his own way. He was a very public figure and a public voice at the time, particularly on the birther controversy, the idea that Obama was not born in the United States and he needs to show his birth certificate right. He's not one of us. We should be suspicious that he's not one of us, right? And all the racial overtones that has. But also, again, trying to invoke this notion that he might be a Muslim. And maybe his birth certificate has evidence that he is a Muslim. And maybe Obama doesn't want us to know that, so he's not actually making public his full birth certificate. So Trump was digging into that narrative as well. Again, none of this is off-the-cuff remarks. This is very calculated stuff, in my opinion. These are folks who know exactly what they're doing. And this is exactly the kind of overt language you did not see early on, for example, in the Bush administration. Whatever other Islamophobic rhetoric might have been there, often it was more implicit. This is not implicit at all. So that gets us to what all of you probably remember is the most recent election. But what you're seeing here again is this trend towards a recognition, at least in the Republican Party, or elements of the Republican Party, not all Republican candidates, that appealing to Islamophobia, trying to tap into anti-Muslim anxiety or hostility, is an overt strategy that they see that has potential, even though it didn't technically work in the long run in the 2012 election cycle. But in 2016 is a different story. For starters, we still have the continuation of this notion that Obama is a Muslim, but you start to see how significant this is in terms of party affiliation, among other things. So it's 54% of Republicans, according to this poll in 2015, a majority, who are articulating this notion that Obama is a Muslim. Much smaller among Democrats, but it's there amongst all these affiliations and across religious boundaries. Among Trump supporters in 2015, August of 2015, 2/3 believe that Obama is a Muslim. He's not even running for the presidency anymore, right? I mean, this was his end of his second term. But that anxiety is there, and that narrative is still being pushed in some quarters because Obama is the face of the Democratic Party. He's still the leader of the Democratic Party. So tying him with being a Muslim, and again, thinking of Muslim as being a word that's really a slur, right? A racial slur in many ways, is very prominent here. As far as some other candidates, Ben Carson was one of the earliest ones to jump out and try the playbook of the likes of Newt Gingrich and Herman Cain from the last election cycle. So in one interview, he argued he would not advocate putting a Muslim in charge of this nation. Muslims shouldn't be allowed to be president. even though the Constitution forbids a religious test. He wouldn't agree with that. He invoked Sharia again, right? This is not an accident. Now we're seeing a very consistent appeal to fear over Sharia law. And he invokes a new tactic that wasn't there in 2012, a fear over something called taqiyya, which a decade ago I wasn't even talking about, but today now everyone's scared of taqiyya. Taqiyya historically comes from Shia Islam, and the rough explanation of this is that this is a doctrine that has allowed Muslims in certain circumstances in which they find themselves under persecution or the life is being threatened, that they can withhold their religious identity from their oppressors or persecutors. What this has become in certain far-right circles in the Islamophobia industry, and then adapted by some prominent presidential candidates like Carson, is a doctrine that Muslims are encouraged by Islam to lie to the rest of us, to hide their true agenda of trying to take over the country, which is not actually what taqiyya is about at all. But it's a strange sounding word, right? And it's like Sharia, it falls in that same category. It sounds like something dangerous. But we have now overt appeals to that with people like Carson. Ted Cruz, after the Brussels terrorist attacks in 2016, famously or infamously suggested that we should patrol Muslim neighborhoods. Let's keep an eye on Muslims and keep them under some sort of kind of security wraps before they can do anything bad, right? So basically make Muslim neighborhoods, wherever those are, I'm still looking for them in the United States, but make Muslim neighborhoods mini security states. If you have any kind of knowledge of Jewish ghettos and security states in Nazi Germany, right? I don't make those comparisons very often. I don't like making Nazi comparisons often. But this is eerie in terms of how it resonates with certain parts of history. But again, this is not an accident. This is not him. This is not a slip of the tongue for Cruz. I actually think he believes this. Trump, I don't have time to go through all of his anti-Muslim proposals because there are many. They are legion. But I'll give you a short rundown at least. Flirting with Muslim ID cards, registration systems, databases, suggesting that Muslims harbor a great hatred towards us, suggesting that Muslims in New Jersey were celebrating and cheering right after 9/11, retweeting real extreme far-right tweets, anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant tweets from Europe, calling for a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the country until we can figure out what the hell is going on. Those are his words in December of 2015. And of course, his infamous Islam hates us. That's just the short rundown. I had a slide that I deleted that had about 30 different statements or incidents right over the campaign where he was invoking some kind of Islamophobic rhetoric. But again, I was even arguing at this time that this is not just because he likes to speak unplugged, right, or unfiltered. I do think this is quite deliberate and quite strategic, and he knows exactly what he's doing. I don't think Trump is an intellectual in the way in a college we might think about the word intellectual. But I do think he is a smart guy in a certain way. I think he knows how to tap into and mobilize fear and to galvanize voters by doing so. And I can't think of a politician in my lifetime in America who does it better than Donald Trump when it comes to that. That takes a certain kind of intelligence, even though I don't think he knows much about Islam. And I still have my doubts whether he believes most of this stuff. Cruz, I think, believes it. Trump, I'm not sure if he actually believes any of it. But maybe it doesn't matter. Right? For the Clinton campaign, Clinton certainly had her moments. The most significant of which was the Democratic National Convention, where she had an opportunity in terms of the drama of the DNC convention, right, to take a shot back at Trump, particularly for the Muslim ban proposal that he had articulated back in 2015. And in doing so, what she does is it gives a platform to Khizr and Ghazala Khan, who are the parents of Captain Humayun Khan. And Captain Humayun Khan was an American military officer in Iraq who died when his base was attacked by a suicide terrorist bomber in 2004. And he's a Muslim. Humayun Khan was a Muslim, buried in Arlington National Cemetery. And his story becomes headline news and front and center in this Democratic National Convention as his parents both tell the story of their son, his service in the military, his sacrifice, and also use this as a way to take a shot at Trump for his bigotry and his targeting of Muslims, including but not limited to the Muslim ban. And politically, at least, I'll say this was quite effective. Donald Trump aside, who still found a way to take a shot at these two, particularly the Ghazala Khan, most candidates and most prominent figures, even in the Republican Party, did not touch this. There is some kind of orthodox narrative about not criticizing the Gold Star family. that's tended to work here. If I had more time, I would quibble a little bit about the way this was done, but generally speaking, politically, I think it was an effective way of trying to counter Islamophobia. But she had moments on the other side too, that maybe weren't given as much attention simply because the bar had been lowered so much by Donald Trump in the campaign that almost anything you say is going to sound better. But Clinton had a golden opportunity at a town hall meeting in St. Louis, Missouri at Washington University in October of 2016 to really push back hard and make a strong statement against Islamophobia. A member of the audience asked a question about the problem of rising Islamophobia and what each of them were going to do about it. I'll spare you the details of Trump's answer because it had nothing to do with Islamophobia. But Clinton, I felt she had, I still think of the metaphor of the thing, volleyball, the setter, right? The person asking the question just set her up beautifully. This was a spike, and not a very difficult spike at that, in terms of an easy answer. But instead, she qualifies her answer, which is kind of a typical Democratic response, which is, of course we should push back against Islamophobia. We must take a stand with our American Muslim neighbors because we need American Muslims to be our eyes and ears on our front lines, in the context of this, is our front lines on the war on terror. This does not go over well in many Muslim Americans. It doesn't go over well with scholars of Islamophobia either, because this is a typical equivocation, right? Muslims are still in this special category that we should protect them or stand with them because they are useful to our counterterrorism initiatives or to our particular policies in the war on terror. And not just coming out and doing what I would do, or if I had a chance to advise her, which will never happen, which is to say, we stand with American Muslims because we are a nation committed to civil liberties, human dignity, and freedom of religion, and you end it. That's a response to Islamophobia. And you don't go into securitizing Muslims or saying that the only reason we are going to stand with them, or the primary reason we stand with them, is because they have some kind of utility for the rest of us. That is not an expectation ever put upon me. But it was put upon Muslims in this case. This was cringeworthy under normal circumstances, but again, because of who she was debating, it wasn't hard for it to come across as being significantly better. But it is a reminder of the challenges Democrats have had with how to respond and how to make a moral argument against Islamophobia. I am not saying Clinton is exceptional in this regard. I'm saying she's actually pretty typical of the Democratic Party in terms of struggling here. Okay, that's where we have been. So we see a trajectory, increasing attention and appeal to Islamophobic narratives, policies, ways of instrumentalizing Islamophobia to galvanize or to mobilize the electorate in the Republican Party. And the Democratic Party doesn't quite know how to find its narrative when it comes to Islamophobia. Sometimes pushing back against it, sometimes kind of pulling back, oftentimes doing a little bit of both, as we've seen in Obama's case and in Clinton's case. That being said, what can we expect as we now go full throttle in the summer and the fall into the 2019-2020 election cycle? Well, I anticipate four specific strategies being employed by the Republican Party leadership, particularly Trump, in the next election cycle. And so I'll tell you what those are in a moment, and then we can just expect more of the same from the Democrats as far as I can tell so far. I think the creeping Sharia narrative has been a winner since 2010 and Newt Gingrich. I think you'll see Trump and his surrogates and maybe a few other authors in the Republican Party continue to push that narrative. I think you will see Trump and his surrogates try more deliberately to conflate Muslims, Middle Easterners, and migrants. Try to turn the debate over immigration south of the border and the need for immigration reform and a wall also into a debate over Muslims and Islam. Which, for some of you, may not sound strange if this is the only election you paid attention to, but in my lifetime, debates over immigration in the United States have not really ever been about debates over Muslims and Islam. In Europe, that's definitely the case. But particularly south of the border, that has not been a debate about Muslims and Islam, but Trump has been trying to make it into that as well. I've brought receipts, so I'm going to show you that in a moment. Framing Muslims as Jew haters. My best guess is that we're going to see a lot more deliberate efforts in the upcoming election cycle to tag Muslims, and a certain Muslim in particular, as anti-Semitic, in a way, again, to try to galvanize voters. And the old standby that's been around for several election cycles and the rhetoric of which goes back to 2005 or so with this radical Islamic terrorism, and again, tying Muslims or tying Islam to that. That's a favorite talking point of Trump's anyway. But there's others in the Republican Party who like this language as well. 1 and 4 are older strategies, dating back at least to 2010, if not earlier. 2 and 3 are newer strategies. Number 2 has been floated out there in the past year or so. Number 3, more deliberately in the past several months. In fact, I'm giving this lecture 6 months ago. I may not be including number 3, but after the past several months, I definitely am expecting number 3 to play a big role. This idea that Muslims are uniquely or inherently anti-Semitic, and that the Democratic Party, because it harbors Muslims in its midst, is therefore anti-Semitic. And I anticipate that the Democratic Party will continue to struggle to know how to respond to that. For fear of being tagged as anti-Semitic, you'll see Democratic members and Democratic politicians sometimes cross into the line of Islamophobia to distance themselves from the critique that they are harboring anti-Semitism in their midst. To give you some examples of how this has already been at work in the past year or two, or coming into the past several months even, just over a year or so ago, earlier in 2018, the Trump-Pence re-election website and the Republican National Committee's website both had a questionnaire. You could have gone onto the website, as I did, and gone through the questionnaire and answered the questions if you want to. Your positions on health care and immigration reform, things like that, the typical election year stuff. But one of the questions on both websites was this one. Are you concerned by the potential spread of Sharia law? And the whole idea that there is a danger of Sharia law, whatever that is, taking over it is absolutely nonsense. A, because of huge ignorance about what Sharia is to begin with. B, Muslims are about 1% of the population. They're not in a position to take over anything. Christians, on the other hand, we can talk about. That being said, that's being put out there, right? It's the Republican Party and the Trump-Pence website that is flirting with the idea of making this a part of its central narrative. One might go so far as saying part of its platform. We'll see. But I think this is deliberate again. I think they're trying to keep the fear-mongering over Sharia out there. This mingling of Muslims, migrants, Middle Easterners, certainly the Muslim ban was partly about that as well, which is going to be one of Trump's signature achievements that he will herald, I think, in the upcoming election. He prioritized this when he first got elected. But you've also seen this in tweets for the past 6 or 7 months. So the tweet on your left, this idea that Middle Easterners, which is code for Muslims, have traveled from the Middle East somewhere in Central America to join a caravan in which they are now going to come up into Mexico and cross the southern border, right? And we should be afraid of that. So he's trying to make immigration south of the border about Muslims. And again, with the notion that there's probably a stronger visceral reaction amongst a certain portion of the electorate if this idea that there are massive numbers of Muslims coming south of the border is out there. And this old myth that's been around for a while but got recirculated again in January of this year, a border rancher who's found prayer rugs at the border. So now we have Muslim Middle Easterners traveling to Central America with prayer rugs, or prayer mats, that take them all the way to the border, then they stop and drop them. And then they keep going. I don't know what they're doing, right? There's no evidence for this. It doesn't make sense. It's Trump, right? It's not supposed to make rational sense, but it's supposed to stir up a certain narrative of fear of Muslims and migrants coming from this. It's not just Muslims infiltrating the country by airplane or from Canada. Now it's south of the border as well. Trying to change the tenor a bit of that debate over immigration. In terms of the numbers 3 and 4, right, Muslim anti-Semitism and the radical Islamic terrorism narratives, I found this news event from 1 month ago today to be quite relevant to this, even though this is not directly about presidential politics, but it is about the political atmosphere that's out there right now, and these narratives and how they're sticking. So on the left-hand side, you have a man named Dr. Muhammad Abu Salah, who is the father of 2 Muslim women who were murdered along with her husband in Chapel Hill, North Carolina in 2015. And some of you might remember this. This was a murder at execution style in their apartment at point blank range by a man who harbored white nationalist tendencies and sympathies. A month ago, on Capitol Hill, there was a hearing on the problem of white nationalism. Did anyone remember that? A lot of the hearing actually didn't focus on that. That's another story. But that was, in theory, what the hearing was supposed to be about. So Dr. Abu Salah was called to testify about the impact, the personal impact, of the rise of white nationalist hate, right, on him and his family, and have a conversation again with those he's testifying to in Congress about and how we can move forward with this. What happens instead for a lot of the questioning of Dr. Abdus-Salam is that he's questioned about whether he taught his daughters to hate, whether he taught his daughters to be violent, whether he or Islam teaches anti-Semitism and the hatred of Jews. Remember what the hearing is about. White nationalism. Remember who he is, the father of 2 murdered daughters. And he's being questioned, not just a little, but a lot, about Islam and whether it promotes hate, whether it promotes violence, the terrorism piece, and whether it promotes anti-Semitism. And there are other people who are called to testify who are pushing the narrative that Islam promotes hatred of Jews, even though that's not what the hearing is about, right? So it's an example, and even on the Democratic Party, there are Democratic congressional representatives who are asking these kinds of questions. In some cases, maybe unwittingly, but they were feeding the narrative. So what we see here is a really effective distraction technique to push the conversation away from white nationalism and back to Islam and its dangers in terms of terrorism or in terms of anti-Semitism. So those narratives are there, and I don't think any of that is an accident. I think this, again, is fairly deliberate, or even if it's unwitting in some cases, it's because of an internalized Islamophobia that's out there. But without a doubt, all 4 of those strategies that I just talked about, creeping Sharia, the Muslim migrants, refugees, conflation, anti-Semitism in Muslims, and radical Islamic terrorism, these strategies are going to be focused on one person as much as possible. And that person is here, Representative Ilhan Omar, who in her very person embodies all the identities that generates anxiety among Trump himself and some of his core supporters. She is a black, progressive, Muslim, woman, former refugee. Everything that we're trying to make America great against, over against that, right? All in one person. And she's very outspoken. She's extremely progressive, actually, compared to much of the rest of the Democratic Party, and that's part of the challenge that Democrats are having. She's too progressive for many of them. So some of her statements and critiques that we'll talk about in a moment of, say, Israel or U.S. foreign policy toward Israel have been opportunities, golden opportunities in some cases, to take those 4 strategies or variations of those 4 strategies and try to funnel them through this one person. In a way that, in criticizing Omar, she becomes now a proxy for all American Muslims, and to the extent that she's in the Democratic Party, making her sort of a poster child of the Democratic Party, it's a way of pushing back against the Democrats. The Democrats are struggling with knowing how to respond to this. So here is an example, taking one of those strategies, creeping Sharia. So Judge Jeanine, I don't know if you ever watched Judge Jeanine, I confess I don't. But I had to watch this because of my work. Jeanine Pirro, Judge Jeanine, has her own show on Fox, and so 2 months ago to this day, at the beginning of her show, she is critiquing Omar for wearing a hijab. So she starts off with that. Okay, here's someone who wears a hijab and she's a congressional representative. Is Omar's adherence to this Islamic doctrine indicative of her adherence to Sharia law? Now we're all of a sudden in Sharia law, right? Which is antithetical to the U.S. Constitution. Can she even be a good American? Can she be loyal to the United States and still be a Muslim? And please keep that in mind because of the irony over some of the accusations leveled against her in terms of whether she was saying that Jews couldn't be loyal, which is something she actually never quite said, right? Or she didn't say. But this is being turned against her in a very profound, powerful way by Pirro, right? But trying to find a way to tag her with Sharia. So the Sharia narrative, right? Omar, Sharia. Omar, anti-Semitism. So she has made some very strong, explicit critical remarks about U.S. foreign policy and its relationship to Israel, the plight of Palestinians, the need for more attention to Palestinian rights, attention to Israeli human rights violations to settlers, et cetera, right? Some of these, early on back in February, did come across to some as invoking anti-Semitic tropes, particularly when she was critiquing money and its involvement in U.S. lobbying efforts in the U.S. government and Congress. For which she did apologize for that. Other statements she has remained pretty clear about that the larger conversation we need to have is about the orthodoxy that exists in both political parties about Israel and its unwillingness to sort of move off a certain position when it comes to Israel. But she has been consistently cast as anti-Semitic despite all sorts of examples I can give today with Trump and others who invoke very explicit anti-Semitic tropes but who haven't received nearly the kind of attention she has received, and none of those triggered the House of Representatives to pass a resolution against anti-Semitism when it did, but all that got pushed onto the House in light of Omar's critiques of U.S. foreign policy in Israel. So here's the anti-Semitic piece, which they keep coming back to. But this is in both parties. So this is Chuck Schumer speaking at AIPAC. AIPAC is one of the lobbying organizations that Omar is so critical of. But when he was speaking at AIPAC at the end of March, he compared Omar's critique of U.S. foreign policy of Israel, mischaracterized it in my opinion, with Trump's calling some of the neo-Nazis shouting anti-Semitic slogans at Charlottesville as very fun people, if you remember that in news events. So he is drawing an equivalence between the two, right? This is the minority leader, the Democratic minority leader in the Senate. But Schumer is one of the leaders of the Democratic Party who's clearly most uncomfortable with Omar, particularly her criticisms of Israel. But in my opinion, he's also saying things that fuels this stereotype that Muslims are Jew haters, or Muslims are sort of have a problem when it comes to anti-Semitism, as opposed to making a distinction between this very fine people comment and whatever he might disagree in terms of policy with Omar, casting her in sort of the same light as Trump on this. But this is sort of classic Democratic Party equivocating again when it comes to Omar. A couple weeks ago, there was a perpetrator of a terrorist attack in a synagogue in San Diego who espoused white nationalist beliefs and had those articulated. It was out there in the public. It seems to be the case that he also tried to burn down a mosque. So what does Ted Cruz do? He gets on Twitter, and instead of criticizing the white nationalist ideology that seemed to have driven the perpetrator of that attack, he takes a shot at Ilhan Omar. So white nationalism seems to be driving the attack on the synagogue and maybe an attack on a mosque as well, but Cruz tries to make this about Ilhan Omar. Not an accident, right? Anytime now you see anti-Semitic anything, anti-Semitic violence, even when it is overtly driven by white supremacy or white nationalism, you should expect some very high-profile efforts to tag this and hitch this to Ilhan Omar. This is a very deliberate strategy. This is why she's taking the time to call him out, right? He's not even taking this opportunity to condemn the attack itself and agree with everyone else. He's using this as a political attack. Also, pretty recently, as we move to the terrorism label, we had a news event, a news cycle in which Ilhan Omar, a video of her back in March at a banquet was discovered. It was never really hidden, but it got rediscovered in April, in which she was making a longer speech about the backlash that Muslims have received in the aftermath of 9/11. And in that speech, she, at one point she says some people did something on 9/11, and then we, as Muslims, have ever since been sort of under a cloud of suspicion and have been targeted, et cetera, et cetera. That's the full context of her talk. But this circulated in a very odd way. A very Islamophobic imam in Australia edited a video in a very particular way to make it seem like she was being dismissive of the 9/11 attacks. And then this was circulated a good bit by Dan Crenshaw of Texas and some other Republicans. Donald Trump, of course, got wind of this, got it. Someone probably helped Trump, because I can't imagine Trump sitting there splicing a video together. But Trump did pin a tweet where he spliced a video together of these remarks from Omar taken out of the full context, together with images of the World Trades that are being attacked. This caused a lot of controversy because, of course, this was definitely an attempt to suggest that Omar was either heartless when it came to the victims of 9/11, or maybe even harboring sympathies for the 9/11 attacks, which has been a narrative that's been put out there about her already. In my opinion, it's all works because of the Islamophobic stereotype that Muslims by default harbor latent violent or terrorist sympathies. So it doesn't take much to generate a certain anxiety among a certain portion of the electorate in terms of convincing them that that's what she's really up to here. But huge spike in death threats targeting her. Also an opportunity for various Democratic candidates, presidential candidates and other leaders to come out and condemn this. This is very overtly Islamophobic, without a doubt. Well, you had, this is by the way the New York Post, a conservative-leaning newspaper, certainly taking a shot at her as well. So here are two presidential candidates in the Democratic Party that again are pretty typical of Democratic responses over the past couple of decades. Sort of saying Islamophobia is really bad, and sort of saying, but we need to we need to qualify it in some way, or our posture, or position ourselves. So you have Gillibrand on the left, who actually seems to accept Trump's version of that narrative, right? That Omar is minimizing at best minimizing the pain of the 9/11 victims. So she actually reinforces that at the beginning of her tweet. Before then she says, oh, by the way, this is also dangerous, right? So you have a little bit of both from her. She's condemning Islamophobia, but she's also taking a position in relation to Ilhan Omar in the context in which Omar is receiving a lot of death threats. Again, if I'm advising any of these folks, I'm saying this is not the time to signal people you have disagreements with Ilhan Omar when her life is being threatened, right? In a very, very deliberate attempt to smear her in a dangerous way. Klobuchar is similar, right? She actually starts off pretty good here. Someone has already been charged with a serious threat on her life. The video the president chose to send out today will only incite more hate. Had she ended it there, that would have been pretty good. But she goes on to say, you can disagree with her words as I've done, but this video is wrong, right? This idea that I've got to signal to you that I don't always agree with Omar, right? So it comes across as a bit of a political posture. So this is another example of a kind of lukewarm, tepid, uncertain response, right? They know they want to respond and push back against Islamophobia, but they're also concerned about their relationship and how their perceived relationship to Omar will be, right? This is where the implicit Islamophobia is coming in. I should say with both of these candidates and many other candidates, there are plenty of other instances in which they've been great in terms of condemning Islamophobia. Both were very strong critics of the Muslim ban and other things. So these aren't the only things they've said. But there is something about Ilhan Omar that is generating a lot of anxiety among Democratic candidates. And they're really, really struggling with how to position themselves in relation to her, even in some very clear circumstances in which the Islamophobia is over. But again, I'm here to say that that's partially because the Democratic Party has never quite come to terms with its own position on Islamophobia. It doesn't know what its moral position on Islamophobia is, at least in terms of leadership. You did see some really strong responses to this as well, though. Sanders and Harris had two strong responses. Here's one from Warren, who actually goes even further to say he's not just inciting hate, he's inciting violence. That's a much stronger response coming from Warren. And therefore, an entire group of people are being sort of tarred with the brush of bigotry. This is disgusting and shameful, and everyone's got to condemn it, right? You can't equivocate with this. So that's what we have with Warren, and I think what we'll see with the Democratic Party is that it will continue to struggle with Omar, in part because the Republican Party will make sure that they have to. And I think particularly Trump and others find a way to put Omar into the headlines. Again, this is going to be deliberate. And any of those four strategies I mentioned earlier are going to be quick go-to narratives to do that with. And we've seen all four of them invoke when it comes to Omar just in the past 2-3 months. I think Trump himself, his surrogates, a few others in the Republican Party, they feel that they have found a winner and using Omar as a weapon when it comes to Islamophobia, and the Democratic Party has yet to, as a whole, to figure out how to respond to that, with some few exceptions. So that's my general take. I'm very much open to discussion, conversation, questions, your own take, your own predictions about maybe Islamophobia and what's to come in the next election. So let's open it up for folks to talk. Maybe we can start with students, as we typically do here at Luther. Students have questions or comments.
Do you see the Democrats possibly taking a stronger stance on Islamophobia, like possibly having it like within their convention rules platform?
I think it may depend upon who wins the primary. I do think based on what I've seen so far, I do think there is a handful of candidates. Remember, the field is ginormous, right? But there are a handful of candidates who I think have been much stronger and much more consistent in combating and countering Islamophobia with their rhetoric than we've seen from much of the Democratic Party over the past 2 decades. Whether they will win the nomination, I don't know, but whoever wins the nomination, I think will have a lot of influence there. So I'm not sure. We'll see. The trend hasn't been great, but we see some promising signs here.
Why do you think so much focus has been brought to Representative Omar rather than Congresswoman Tlaib?
I think there's a couple reasons. One, because Islamophobia is always about race, but race operates on different levels, particularly in the American context. I think the fact that Omar is a black Muslim woman has something to do with that. She's also, I mean, so is Tlaib. She's also very outspoken. It's not like one of them's outspoken and the other one's kind of quiet as a mouse. They're both very outspoken, but I think on some of these issues, Omar has been much more consistently in the media in terms of, and on Twitter particularly, taking advantage of her new platform to push these narratives. But I'm not at a point where I'm thinking, you know, Tlaib's not going to be pulled into this sooner or later. I mean, she's been pulled into some already. And I do think if she continues to make outspoken critiques about Israel, for example, which she has been, you should expect to see Tlaib as part of this narrative as well. There's something about them being women, too. I mean, these aren't the first Muslims to be in Congress, but they are the first Muslim women. You know, Carson from Indiana is still in Congress. Keith Ellison was who Omar replaced, and Ellison was such a controversy here and there. He was not under that kind of intense scrutiny in the way that she has been. Tlaib said something, though, I really found helpful with this, though, about why Omar herself has been targeted so much. And it's about being a first. It's difficult to be the first Muslim woman in Congress, and in this case, the first 2 Muslim women. But to be a person of color, a Muslim woman, right, in a rampant age of Islamophobia means that everything you say will be heard oftentimes in the worst possible light. And we kind of call that bad faith interpretations, right? But you have a population that's already fairly primed to assume the worst. It's precisely because of how significant Islamophobia has been in America the past couple of decades. So that's part of what's going on here too, right? Omar is very outspoken. She's very blunt. She's unapologetic. And on top of that, anything she says will be heard in the worst possible light. Tlaib is trying to raise awareness of that, right? That this is she's not going to be given the benefit of the doubt. It's the exact opposite, and that's why she's a lightning rod. Yeah.
Yeah, I had a question on how you thought the media plays in all this. You brought up, like, in 2010, that, like, the Islamophobia industry was a big part of making the Muslim-centered an issue. And that, how do you, besides just that, like, the Islamophobia industry, how do you see, like, the media overall, whether that's, like, just social media or actual publication, playing a role in those?
Media has played a significant role. The Islamophobia industry itself has been very savvy, both with social media. Its social media presence is massive. Mine pales in comparison. In terms of their ability to use Twitter and Facebook and blogs and that sort of thing. They know, anyone knows what SEO is, right? Search engine optimization. Google search is how you get your site to rank high. The Islamophobia industry does that really, really well. Really well. So they know how to use the internet, to use social media, and even to use mainstream media. They knew how to create a story out of an Islamic center, proposed Islamic center that had already been passed by the zoning commission in Lower Manhattan in the fall of 2010, and no one uttered a peep until Pamela Geller got a hold of it and started blogging. Now the power of blogs, right? And her blog, at least. Mainstream media, just frankly, we have critical media studies, one after the other. It's just consistent. Mainstream media gravitates heavily towards stories that connect violence or terrorism to Islam. Disproportionately so, I think. One study that my students in my Islamophobia class have read, 449% greater coverage of stories of Muslims and terrorism in the United States than non-Muslims or even right-wing terrorism, even though Muslims in the time period studied constitute only 12% or so of the terrorist attacks. But they're getting 449% more coverage, right? So that's one of the reasons why these narratives stick, right? Because this is what the media is showing us. And the mainstream media is guilty across the board. It is doing a horrific job of telling nuanced stories about Muslims and Islam and not getting into sensationalized stories of Islamic terrorism, as they might frame it, or the oppression of women, which are the two go-to narratives of mainstream media. And I'm not just talking about Fox News, that's an easy target. I'm talking about CNN and MSNBC, the New York Times, a study from an organization called Toronto 416 Labs a couple of years ago found that in New York Times headlines, Islam was treated more negatively than stories about cocaine and cancer. Islam can't beat cocaine and cancer in New York Times coverage. That's telling us something, right? I'm also kind of curious about the positive cocaine stories out there. And I'm sure someone out here probably knows, it's medical advances or whatever. But this is the problem we have. The media is a huge part of the problem. because of what it's trying to do. It's trying to attract viewers and website visitors, and these are the kinds of stories that reinforce narratives that people tend to be drawn to. Yes, back there.
Okay, so first of all, I want to say that thank you so much for your lecture. I think it was really awesome. So my question is, like overall in the world there are like a lot of Muslims, right? 1.6 billion Muslims, 1 billion Muslims, and like what should we? And even the US is like a couple of thousand Muslims. What should we do the Muslim people like in this? Because it's all about them, right? Like we're trying to like have the Muslims. Like what should be the rule of us? Because I feel like no matter what we do, there is like always a double standard. Like, you know, like there are just as many like other terrorist people as like Muslim, even more. Like, like, no matter what we do, there's always a double standard. So like, what can we do? What do you think should be like a viewpoint or our early stand that we can?
So if I'm hearing you correctly, the larger question is what can we do about Islamophobia? I mean, in a nutshell, right? Did I get that right?
Yeah, like what like from a Muslim point of view? Like,
Oh, what can Muslims do about Islamophobia?
Yeah.
Whew, and that's a harder one. I'm usually hesitant to give Muslims a lot of direct advice, only because I would never go into a synagogue and say, hey, Jews, this is what you need to be doing to do more about anti-Semitism. I interviewed several years ago a Jewish activist in New York City who combats Islamophobia. And she said if a Christian ever came into synagogue and said, here's what you Jews need to do to combat anti-Semitism, she said you would get an earful. Like, anti-Semitism isn't coming from us, right? It's your problem. You know, you go out and fight it. But generally speaking, it's clear that for Muslims, as it is for Jews with anti-Semitism, this is about, in some ways, it's about safety and at the risk of sounding overly dramatic, it's about survival in some cases, right? Lives and livelihoods are at stake. What do we know then about how the needle is moved about Islamophobia? And this really is indicative of other prejudices as well. One of the things we know in the short term that helps is speaking out against it. And the overwhelming silence that we've encountered from majority populations in places like the United States and Europe, including from politicians, has been a big part of the problem. Or the equivocating I've been talking about. The Democratic Party is part of the problem. It's an uncomfortable thing to say. I get criticized for saying that sometimes, but I'm not going to stop saying it until the Democratic Party and the Republican Party change their tune. They don't have to do politics like that because people's lives are at risk. But in the short run, you speak out, you challenge, you challenge your best friends, you challenge your aunt at Thanksgiving dinner, I don't know, but you challenge the media. And when these politicians come to Decorah, and we will have them come to Decorah soon, right? We have a lot more power than you think, and you challenge them. You put them on the spot. You ask them questions about where they stand on Islamophobia, where they stand on the Muslim ban. And if they don't give a halfway decent answer, you make sure they know that. You hang that around their neck like an albatross, so that when the media has to follow them after Decorah, they will have to continue to come back and explain themselves why they did not give a decent answer on Islamophobia. That's the short run. Long run, relationships, which is not something I can give any of you in an hour, right? But we know from studies from decades, and this was originated in the studies on race relations in the 1950s, that personal relationships are game changers. When it comes to almost any form of racism, not just Islamophobia, race relations, anti-black racism, anti-Semitism. If I know someone who's Muslim and I'm not, I am much less likely to be Islamophobic. If I have a personal relationship with them, if I have a personal relationship with someone who's Jewish, statistically I'm much less likely to be anti-Semitic. So relationships really do matter. Yet we have a number of studies in America that suggest that anywhere from half to 2/3 of Americans don't know a Muslim, or they don't think they know a Muslim. So it's a tricky way to interpret these studies, right? They don't think they know a Muslim. So relationship building, what I would call interfaith work, is really key to this. And so if Muslims recognize that that's important, I still have to say that with some qualification, because me having a relationship with someone who's Muslim doesn't mean I necessarily go out and start a movement to change policies. You've got to figure out how to translate those relationships into political change and grassroots political change, which we don't do very well. We have not been doing very well with Islamophobia. But the other thing is I'm very concerned about sending the message to Muslims, who are 1% of the population in America. If you could go out today and make 400 friends who aren't Muslim, 500 would be really nice, that would be awesome. And putting all this burden and this pressure on Muslims to sort of make these connections. The relationships matter, but I recognize the problems that come with calling that out. But nonetheless, when we make relationships across racial and religious boundaries, we can make a difference. But those relationships are not there now. Even after 9/11, all these years, we were still struggling in the United States when it comes to building these relationships. But I do think the moral responsibility, the primary moral responsibility for combating Islamophobia falls on people like me, who are not Muslim. It's emanating from people like me. It's emanating from political and media elite who try to represent my interest. And so the responsibility to combat this is primarily on people with my background, I think. And Muslims can then signal to me how I can do a better job of being a good friend and ally and things I can do to help the Muslim community. But I try not to say, Muslims, you need to get out there and do more. Right? But I think it's a good question. Yeah.
So do you see the same trends happening with our leaders who there's not a lot of movement, it looks like Islamophobia is just going to continue to grow? Do you see those same trends throughout the general population, or do you think there could be or has been greater change in the general population? Like, are more people becoming continually frustrated with Democratic leaders, for example, who aren't taking a strong stance?
Yeah, I think the paradox of Ilhan Omar is that she's a great source of anxiety, but she's also a great source of inspiration and hope, right? Particularly among younger Americans, I mean, kind of a lot of people were in love with her. I mean, almost literally. This is a politician who speaks in a way, who takes positions, and who has a kind of courage in her rhetoric that a lot of us, and I will even say me, I have a fixation with her too, right? That she actually is thinking outside the box and pushing back against some orthodox narratives. And don't take this too far. There's something there that is an echo to what you've seen with Trump, right? This pushing back against the establishment. That helped Trump resonate with certain people who were kind of fed up with both parties and sort of politics as usual. So I think you're seeing that with Omar. I think kind of what she represents is a good way to get at that question in terms of pushing back against Islamophobia. And I do think she's changed the conversation on Israel for all the controversy that surrounded her on Israel. I have seen some politicians that I did not think would sort of, think twice about how they talk about Israel, start to do so amongst this presidential candidate field right now. So I do see some of that. And the amount of energy, in the protest against the Muslim ban, you remember all the people went out to airports and things like that. I mean, I think after the election of Trump and some of those policies being enacted, there are certainly more concerted efforts to push back against Islamophobia in the general population. And even I, as someone who does, many of you know this is what I do for a living when I'm not doing other things. I speak about Islamophobia publicly. I travel a lot around the country. I got far more people reaching out to me from churches than ever after 2016. Churches that I think knew Islamophobia was wrong before then, right? But they hadn't been doing much about it, and they hadn't been trying to figure out what is our responsibility. And now I'm starting to see more of that, more efforts. So I do have hope in the general population. But then again, there were 60 million people or so who voted for Trump. Not because they're all bigots or Islamophobes, I'm not saying that. I'm simply saying that 60 million people or so somehow reconciled their moral frameworks and compasses with a man who was that overtly Islamophobic, and that's a difficult thing to talk about. Then again, as I said, the Democratic Party, it's not like it's the exact opposite. So for those of us who are trying to find a leader on this, it's been hard. Yeah, stop.
I think you said that before 2010, there was only a smaller group of far right.
Some of the narratives were, like the Sharia stuff was on the fringe of the far right.
Yeah. Did you, or I don't know if this is part of your research, but do you know why this may have accelerated more than trending to far right ideology in general, or do you see them to be correlated or interrelated?
Well, in addition to what I mentioned earlier in terms of certain news events in the cycle, right, that became moments where some operatives and some prominent politicians started to rethink their strategy about, well, maybe I can actually go there where Bush wouldn't go. Bush is Islam as religion of peace, right? Trump is Islam hates us. That's a pretty big gap. Right? What has happened in between then? But these controversies like the Ground Zero Mosque, so-called Ground Zero Mosque controversy, certainly gave these openings where these strategies were tried out a little bit more under the assumption that there was a significant portion of the population who did have a lot of anxiety. And instead of trying to quell their anxiety, the strategy was to ramp it up, because that strategy of fear can be quite effective. That being said, the Islamophobia industry itself has a lot to do with this, and what has made them effective. From a very much a fringe movement in 2007, 2008, to the point where I deleted these slides. I was going to mention this, but you have Ted Cruz, who has someone like Frank Gaffney, a part of the Islamophobia industry, as his national security advisor during his campaign. John Bolton wrote the foreword to a book authored by Pamela Geller and Robert Spitzer, the two people behind the Ground Zero mosque controversy. Mike Pompeo, our Secretary of State, received one of the highest awards from Act for America, a very virulent anti-Muslim hate group, one of the most significant ones in the country. These are people who have a lot of influence. National Security Advisor Bolton, Secretary of State Pompeo, right? I could have gone on about Steve Bannon. Kellyanne Conway has ties to Frank Gaffney, and these fringe figures now, they have access to Washington. They have access to the White House. They have access to the executive branch of government, not to mention many in the Congress as well. And they were fringe players just a decade ago. What has changed that? They have a lot of money. This is a multi-million, we now know, billion-dollar industry. A recent report from the Council of American Islamic Relations that came out this past week found that in 39 anti-Muslim hate groups that was tracking between 2014 and 16, they had access to a revenue of $1.5 billion. These are organizations that all they do is Islamophobia. It's not like they're like volunteering at the Humane Society and the Red Cross, and then on the side they do some Islamophobia. This is all they do. And they have $1.5 billion. What Luther College could do with $1.5 billion, right? But they've got it. So there's a lot of money there. But what else we have learned is that, and this is a hard conversation to have because Israel is such a difficult conversation to have, is that a lot of these anti-Muslim hate groups have found some success because they have very hyper-Zionist ideologies, right? Not just pro-Israel, but like extremely pro-Israel to the point that Palestinians aren't even human. But the pro-Israel piece has appeal to people in Washington, right? And frankly across the political spectrum, but they've been targeting mostly Republicans here. So their ideologies are kind of coming together. So you've seen this group move more and more into the mainstream as a result, right? But yeah, they weren't players at all in 2008. Bush, for the most part, wouldn't have, I can think of one or two exceptions, but for the most part wouldn't have had anything to do with these figures. Obama certainly didn't. But by 2015, 2016, they are advising significant presidential candidates, if not the current White House. That's how much has changed in a decade. Yes?
Are there any 2020 Democratic candidates that stand out from the others with more consistent and overt condemnation of Islamophobia?
Yeah, I do think, as exhibited by this latest controversy with Omar, the Warren, Sanders, Harris have been pretty fairly consistent and not equivocating. That's what I look for. Some people call me nitpicky, and that's fine. You can call me nitpicky. This is my job. Not just condemning Islamophobia, which is fine, right? But doing it in an unequivocal way, particularly when the circumstances call for it, like death threats against a Muslim congresswoman, right? You don't have to qualify that with anything. Just say this is horrific. And those three come to mind. Mayor Pete Buttigieg, did I get that right? It'll take me a few more months to get it right. After New Zealand, I thought his statement to the Muslim community in South Bend, Indiana was extraordinary. Not only because he's condemning the hate, but he made a very strong positive statement for inclusion, which is something that I think is the next step for the Democratic Party if it can ever get to the point of understanding why it should condemn Islamophobia unequivocally. But if you take a chapter out of Martin Luther King, right, he could condemn white moderates and white supremacy and the KKK and all that, but King's power was also his ability to use words to cast a vision for what he sees America to be in terms of race relations. Can we find Democratic candidates who can use positive language as well to sort of paint a picture of what America should be when it comes to the inclusion of American Muslims? And I thought Buttigieg, after Christchurch, New Zealand, did a really good job of doing that for his community. So and many of them have had their moments, some good moments where they've condemned Islamophobia. They just seem to struggle a lot more when it comes either to anything about Israel or particularly about Omar. Omar seems to be a a person they just don't know quite how to position themselves with, and when is it appropriate and when is it not to sort of signal that you disagree with her. And I was going to use other examples of Nancy Pelosi and others whose initial response to her was also equivocal, and then she later came up with much stronger condemnation, which simply says that when these politicians are pushed, hey, that was not good enough, do better, Pelosi, that they hear that, they feel that pressure in a way that maybe 4 or 5 years ago that wouldn't have been the case. Yeah.
So going forward, do you foresee Islamophobia, like post Trump? Do you foresee Islamophobia continuing to be a part of like the Republican platform with future Republican candidates to ignite the Republican base in the way that Trump has?
I think it's going to continue to be a strategy so long as you have operatives in the party who see it as a winning strategy. And I haven't seen anything yet that leads me to believe that they believe it's not. I think the reason they're doing all this is because they think it works. So we'll have to change. Something would have to change in a significant way at the polls. I mean, it's starting to lose elections, not just the presidency, but at other levels too, for, I think, the Republican Party to rethink its strategy. I do want to say, though, because I know this comes across as just uber anti-Republican. I don't mean it to be like that. I'm not weighing in on healthcare policies or tax reform or anything like that. Just this one issue, right? But the Republican Party wasn't always like this. 20 years ago, this was very different. And I do think if the Republican Party moved away from these more overt Islamophobic strategies, in time you would have a much more diverse voting patterns among Muslim Americans. They are a very diverse community in some of their perspectives and views. It's maybe for some obvious reasons after 9/11 that they tend to go Democratic now overwhelmingly so, particularly this last election. But I don't think there's anything inherently Islamophobic about the Republican Party at all, or the Democratic Party for that matter. But it has become a winning strategy. That's the problem. They have to start losing with the strategy and for us to see a significant change. But I haven't seen anything so far recently to suggest that that's happening. But let's see what happens in 2020. And let's see if that changes the conversation a bit. We do need, in both parties, some more courageous voices who can stick to the conservative or progressive values or whatever that they have, but not do so in a way that demonizes and dehumanizes a group of people based on race or religion, or in the case of Islamophobia, how those two often get conflated. We need more intellectual and moral courage from both parties, and we've been struggling with that. Yes?
Kind of going along with that question, do you think that, the decline in ISIS influence and overall terrorist attacks against America could eventually make Republican Islamophobia kind of irrelevant to their election stances? Because, it is on the decline.
Yes, we'll see how long it stays in decline, or if another group replaces ISIS. Problem we've had, though, is this U.S. militarism and constant warfare drives a lot of Islamophobia. One of my core arguments from the book I wrote several years ago is that foreign policy drives domestic Islamophobia quite a bit. When you're in a constant state of war, and the primary way we look at Muslim-majority countries is, metaphorically speaking, through the sight of a gun, that's going to have devastating consequences for Muslims here at home. It's very easy, and this has happened many times in American history, for whoever you perceive the enemy to be abroad, you start to target the symbolic stand-ins here at home. Think Japanese-American internment, right? Who were we fighting in 1944? And the Japanese, right? What happens then with Roosevelt, Japanese-American internment? They become the symbolic stand-ins for the enemy abroad, right? The people we need to fear from within us, who represent the enemy over there. And you've seen a lot of that, I think, with Muslims in terms of how they've been targeted as well. Yes, if we can get out of this war on terror business and out of the military-industrial complex period, you will see a big change when it comes to Islamophobia. That would involve a significant rethinking of policy, including the amount of money we apportion to the Department of Defense from both parties. And I haven't seen them move in that direction yet. But when we get out of the war on terror, we can stop being a military state and involving a lot of militarism abroad, military intervention abroad. We'll see less terrorist activity, I think, and then I think we'll see a decline in Islamophobia. That's why it's a good reason to be anti-war, right?
Do
Do you think that the anti-Semitic trope in Islamophobic kind of rhetoric is really genuine, or do you think it's used as a way to like vilify people like Representative Omar or the Muslim population?
I think oftentimes when it's used, that trope is used, I think it's meant to silence criticism of Israel, because that is a conversation both parties still struggle to have in a very nuanced way. How can you talk about what is appropriate support for the state of Israel, and when have we crossed the line into some egregious human rights violations that normally would not be part of our values that we profess, but we let it go there because it serves U.S. interest, right? So changing that's part of the anti-Semitic trope purpose, right? It's the criticizing of silencing criticism of Israel. The other thing about it, I think, is that it invokes a bigotry that most Americans identify as something is bad. Anti-Semitism bad. I don't hear many. I mean, we have these white nationalists and stuff, of course, who are doing horrific things. But most people across both political parties and beyond would say that anti-Semitism is horrific. They would invoke that history of the Holocaust and other things to express the reason for that, right? Whereas Islamophobia, we're still debating. This is why I'm frustrated with the work I do. We're still debating whether it's okay to be bigoted or to prejudicial, to discriminate or to exclude Muslims, or to single them out for national security reasons, or to survey Muslim neighborhoods and things like that. Things that had Cruz said, let's survey Jewish neighborhoods, right? What would we have done? Cruz's career would be over. I have people who've forgotten this because so much other Islamophobic rhetoric has taken place in the past several years. We forget that Cruz said, oh yeah, just go start surveying, right? So by casting Muslims as anti-Semitic, you project upon them in some ways all these other anxieties, bigotry and that sort of thing that the majority population and many of these politicians are not wanting to deal with. I think a lot of Islamophobia is distraction. In my latest book, I used Toni Morrison as a way of getting into that. She famously said back in the 1970s that the very serious function of racism is distraction. And what she means by that is that for anti-black racism, African Americans are constantly on the defensive. Have to explain themselves, explain their contributions to America, explain their history, their art, their literature, to a majority population that never seems quite convinced. So they have to keep doing it over and over again, and Morrison says it's exhausting. But it distracts the majority population too, right? As long as we're putting a group of people in the defensive, we don't have to sort of take account of our own sins, if you will. And I think that's what a lot of Islamophobia is. Put Muslims on the defensive, let the rest of us off the hook about our own problems, which I argued in the book I wrote last year that primarily includes our own violent past and our own ongoing complicity in the violent world order. We wouldn't even be talking about ISIS right now if it wasn't for a horrific decision to invade Iraq, which is just part and parcel of U.S. militarism way of thinking in both parties. So we have fed the very terrorism that we're fighting. And that's the same with Al-Qaeda. You can't tell the story of Al-Qaeda apart from U.S. Cold War policy. And so the Afghan war particularly, right? It's a messy story. I'm not saying it's just all the U.S. I'm just saying that this is the history that people don't know. But as long as we're drumming up fear of Muslims and Jew-hating Muslims, we don't have to deal with our own anti-Semitism, we don't have to deal with our own racism, we don't have to deal with our own violence. And that's what we're seeing in these narratives. And they work. That's why people do it. Yes?
My question is in two parts.
Okay.
And I want to have you help me sort through this.
Okay.
And get your thoughts on it. My question would be if anyone would urge non-Muslims to not befriend Muslims, and if they did befriend Muslims, they'd be like one of them. Would that be a form of phobia, Islamophobia, or hate speech, or bigotry? That's my first part.
Can you ask that again? I'm trying to get my head around.
But if anyone would urge a non-Muslim not to befriend a Muslim, not to take them as friends, would that be a form of Islamophobia, hate speech, kind of thing?
Well, I mean, in the context of rampant Islamophobia, I mean, my first reaction would be, why in the world would they say that, right? What sort of ideology does one have that says, don't befriend Muslims? Why? Right? And would you say that about Jews or Catholics?
You'd be one of them.
Oh, yeah, no, that's very problematic rhetoric, I think, ways of thinking. You had a second?
Yeah, second one was, I just have you help me through this.
Yeah.
It's in Quran 5:51. Allah is urging, says to the Muslims here, O you who have believed, do not take the Jews and the Christians as friends. They are friends to one another. And whoever among you takes them as friends, so surely he is one of them. And in the last verse, surely Allah does not guide the unjust people. Would Allah be advocating sort of bigotry against Jews and Christians in that rhetoric?
So there's several things. Whenever someone quotes the Quran to me, that I say, and you don't have to answer if you don't want to. Are you a Muslim? Is this your sacred text?
This is from the Quran.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to help you.
Yeah, no, and this will help my answer. Are you yourself Muslim?
No.
Okay, good, thanks, that helps. So the larger question here is, how do we read someone else's sacred text? Text that's not our own, right? What kind of authority would Christians give to Muslims who wandered into a church and said, I just opened up to Ephesians and I read a passage that says, slaves, obey your masters. I think I know something about you now. You Christians love slavery, right? You're slaveholders. Now I imagine a lot of Christians would say, that's not how we interpret that passage, or that's not how we interpret that passage anymore. It has been interpreted that way, right? And all sorts of passages from Genesis to Revelation that have some very unsavory stories in them, right? But how do Christians interpret their own text? In what context do they interpret their own text? It's the same with the fifth surah from the Quran, or any surah from the Quran you read. I would say you look to Muslims to help us understand how they interpret that text, and whether they interpret that text in isolation, what kind of context was the verse revealed in to begin with? What else does the Quran have to say about Jews and Christians as people of the book? What do we know in Islamic history about the place that Christians and Jews had in the Islamic Empire to protect the people? That sort of thing. It's a very complex question, in other words. So it's okay to read a passage from the Quran. But then the next question is, how do Muslims interpret that? And I would want Muslims to be my teacher in how they understand that passage, just as I imagine Christians would want to be the teachers of those who are not Christian when it comes to the passage from Ephesians, or wives submit to your husbands, or the genocide of the Amalekites, or the horrific things in the book of Judges. We can go and spend a whole day in the book of Judges, right? I mean, there's some horrific stuff there, right? But it's fair to let Jews, Christians, other people for whom that is their sacred text, to take the lead in helping us interpret what that means, and then look at what people actually do. And if you have ISIS who does horrific things towards Jews and Christians, we should absolutely condemn them. And when we see Muslims and Jews here in the United States actually bind themselves together to respond to the collective bigotry that they're facing recently, and in the face of the rise of white nationalism, we take that seriously too, and start to recognize, well, there must be something else in the Islamic tradition that's inspiring Muslims to create these bonds and these friendships with Jews as well. Thank you, everyone, for coming tonight. I know we've kept you here a bit of time, so go out, have fun, do whatever it is you're going to do on Thursday night. You don't have class tomorrow, right? So, but thanks for the great questions, and let me know if you have any other follow-up questions. Otherwise, I hope to see you around. Thanks.